Okay, we're going to talk about the aftermath of the Federman fight. I guess did we not get through that, did we? Yeah, we did, because I think the last thing we told you is after the Federman fight and the bodies had been gathered, Colonel Carrington was quite certain that the Indians would attack the fort. And he was so certain that they may be overtaken because they had lost those men, that he put all the women and children in the fort in the middle of the grounds in the powder magazine, with the thought that if the Indians breached the fort, that they would blow up the powder magazine and kill the women and children, because that would be a better death than if they were captured by the hostile Indians. So that's kind of where we left, right?
Yeah.
Well, in the end, the Indians did not attack the fort as expected, which takes us to our next subtopic, which is the Wagenbachs fight. The Wagenbachs fight. Now again, the Wagenbachs fight was just another assault by the hostile Indians who did not like Fort Phil Kearney. And what they were doing in this particular fight is they were trying to repeat what they had done in the Federman victory in the summer of '67. So, on August 2nd of 1867, trying again to repeat the victory that summer, approximately 800 Sioux warriors attacked woodcutters and soldiers that were camped at a cutting area about 5 miles from Fort Phil Kearney. Okay? So again, Indian warriors attempt to repeat the Federman victory in the summer of 1867, and on August 2nd of 1867, approximately 800 Sioux warriors attack woodcutters and soldiers who are camped about 5 miles from Fort Phil Kearney. About 800. And there were only 32 woodcutters and soldiers against 800. 32. About 5 miles away from Fort Phil Kearney. So on August 2nd of 1867, what happens is 800 warriors are trying to get another victory over Union soldiers. So they attack a group of woodcutters, which was 6, and 26 soldiers, where they are camped about 5 miles from Fort Phil Kearney. And during the initial stages of the battle, the 26 soldiers and 6 civilians took cover inside an oval of wagon boxes. They took the tops off of the wagon boxes, because they had the wheels, and surrounded themselves with those wagon boxes in a big circle so they'd have something to protect themselves from behind. Okay? So during the initial stages of the battle, 26 soldiers and 6 civilians took cover inside an oval of wagon boxes to protect themselves. Now, these men were armed with breech-loading rifles. Anybody know what a breech-loading rifle is? No? Yeah, I have one at home. It's called a trapdoor. Basically, you open it up and stick the shell in and bring it down and fire it. Breech it, pop it open one at a time. I have one at home.
Oh, like a spring shotgun.
Kind of, only it's for 45-70 shells. But you can put one at a time in, so it's slow. Well, these soldiers and civilians were commanded by Captain James Powell. So they're armed with breech-loading rifles. They're single shot, and I think Brady has a good, not exactly, but it's like putting a single shot shotgun shell in, firing it, popping it open, putting another one.
The gun like folded in half.
Well, kind of. These are breech loaders, and what happened is you popped them open, stuck the shell in, and brought it down, aimed and fired, popped it open.
So the belt doesn't pop down?
No. I'll have to maybe I'll bring mine in and show it to you. They'll let me do that. So I'll bring it in and show it to you maybe tomorrow. We'll see it after the test. They're interesting. They were the same rifles used at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And what happens after you fire so many shells through them, you know, it's supposed to pop out when you flip it open, the trap door, but it didn't. It was getting stuck, and so in the Custer battle, it got so hot they had to take their knives and pull them out, which was even slower. So anyway, we'll just repeat that. So these soldiers and civilians are equipped with breech-loading rifles, and they were commanded by Captain James Powell. And believe it or not, they held off these 800 Indians until an Army relief force came and chased them off, so to speak. So James Powell and those 32 men, 26 soldiers and 6 civilians, held off those 800 Indians from behind those wagon boxes with breech-loading rifles until they could get reinforcements. 3 of those men were killed and 2 more were wounded, which wasn't bad concerning the assault they were under. So 3 of the men were killed and 2 more were wounded. And the Indian casualties are not certain. It was estimated as low as 5 to 60 killed and as low as 5 to 100 wounded. We never really got a very good count on the number. So no more than 60 killed, no more than 100 wounded, probably much less. But it was a fight that was called, in Fort Phil Kearney history anyway, the Wagenbachs fight. Okay, that'll take us to our last subtopic of Native Americans, which is the end of Fort Phil Kearney. The end of Fort Phil Kearney. Well, by January of 1867, I think I gave you the wrong date, just a second. I told you August 2nd, 1867?
Yeah.
It's 66, excuse me. August 2nd of 1866. So in January of 1867, Colonel Carrington was relieved of his command at Fort Phil Kearney and was restationed at Fort Casper by present-day Casper, Wyoming. So in January of 1867, Colonel Carrington was relieved of his command at Fort Phil Kearney and was restationed at Fort Casper. Now, there were a lot of false accounts that really destroyed Carrington's military career. Things that weren't true that were said about him at Fort Phil Kearney. And as a result, he spent the rest of his life trying to re-up his reputation or trying to clear his name. So after he departed Fort Phil Kearney, many false accounts started to destroy Carrington's military career, and he really spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name. Now, Margaret Carrington, his wife, the lady who had picked the site, she died not long after the events of Fort Phil Kearney. So he loses his first wife. But he remarries a familiar name, Frances Grumman. No, Frances Grumman. Look in your notes. So Margaret Carrington dies. What? What was he? Where did he die?
He died in
He died in the Federman fight. Didn't he lead the cavalry?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what happened is Margaret Carrington died, and Colonel Carrington eventually remarried Frances Grumman, who was Lieutenant Grumman's widow, which was probably a good, honestly, probably a good deal for both. Now, it's kind of interesting because both Margaret Carrington and Frances Grumman Carrington both wrote books about their experiences at Fort Phil Kearney. Mrs. Carrington as Colonel Carrington's wife, and Mrs. Grumman as the widow of George Grumman. They both wrote books. The interesting thing about the 2 books is they had opposite opinions. They weren't on the same page. One of them embellished her experiences at Fort Phil Kearney, and the other one told it how it was. Who was who?
Carrington embellished. Grumman told it how it was.
That's exactly right. Margaret Carrington in her book, embellished her experiences at Fort Phil Kearney, because that was kind of the political thing to do to promote this Indian war. So she did the right thing politically and kind of embellished or told stories that maybe weren't exactly true, that made the Army look much better than it was. Whereas Franny Grumman Carrington took a more realistic approach to the conditions of Fort Phil Kearney, and her account really gave people a real understanding of the suffering that went on in that fort. So she kind of told it how it was realistically, whereas Margaret Carrington embellished her experiences because that was the political thing to do to promote the American West. Now, the second Mrs. Carrington's book did a lot to help clear her husband's reputation, because once she told really how it was at Fort Phil Kearney and the hardships and the decisions that Colonel Carrington had to make, his reputation was a little bit better restored because of her book. The man that probably gets too much credit was William J. Federman himself. I'll tell you a little bit about him. Okay, William J. Federman. He was the man that probably is more heroic than he really should be. He was really kind of stupid when you think about it. Okay, well, he was an orphan, and he was never married. So there's no one going to defend his actions that day because nobody really knows the guy. So the credit he gets is not that of a hero, realistically. The credit he gets is that of what? Somebody that made a really bad decision. He gets blamed for the entire embarrassment of the Federman massacre because there's no one there to restore his reputation like Franny did for her husband. He's an orphan, okay? Not even mom and dad. Never married. He's about as lonely and single as you could be. So there's nobody there to defend his honor. So he gets blamed for the defeat. Well, by 1868, the Union Pacific Railroad had reached a point in the West where travelers didn't need to use these Bozeman forts anymore. They simply got on the train east of the Mississippi and it took them to where they wanted to go. They didn't have to go overland, and as a result, the forts weren't needed to protect anybody. Does that make sense? Or a place for them to winter. So, in 1868, another treaty was signed between the government and Native Americans called simply the Treaty of 1868. And this Treaty of 1868 stated that the United States would close the Bozeman Trail and they would abandon all those forts on the trail. So this victory at the Federman Massacre really kind of laid the groundwork, and the fact that the Union Pacific Railroad came in, that these forts were no longer needed or trusted. And as a result of that, they signed a treaty called the Treaty of 1868, in which the government said they would close the Bozeman Trail to overland travel and abandon the forts that had occupied that trail. So, what they do at Fort Phil Kearney? In August of 1868, they simply abandoned it, just left it. They just left it. So, as a result of that, when you go to Fort Phil Kearney, you can go and see this magnificent fort that's still in place, right? No, you see nothing. There's really nothing there, except your imagination, which I even think is the better part. But what happened once they abandoned the fort, the Cheyenne Indians came in and burnt the fort to the ground. I have a really nice pewter bust here that's worth a little bit. I'll show it to you. And this is basically a picture of a Cheyenne Indian, or a bust of a Cheyenne Indian, tearing down the sign that says Fort Phil Kearney as they attack this fort and burn it to the ground So there is absolutely no remnants. They don't want any fort there. Why would they leave an eyesore up there? They simply came in and tore the fort down and burned it to the ground. And that's the way you see it today. There are some boundary marks so you can tell kind of where what is, and they got these number stakes, and number 2 is the, you know, enlisted men's barracks, etc. And you know where the bakery was and all that. It's kind of cool to use your imagination, but basically Fort Phil Kearney simply was abandoned and the Cheyenne Indians burned it to the ground. In 1963, not 1963, Fort Phil Kearney was designated as a National Historic Landmark, and that's why you have the museum and the area today. So in 1963, the federal government designated Fort Phil Kearney as a National Historic Monument and Landmark, and they have done a lot of neat things there. What they've done is they've gone in and built replicas of the sides of the wall, maybe from here to the wall there, just so you can kind of see how tall they were. And then they have the fort laid out and kind of boundary where you can tell where things are. And then you see the cemetery, which is still there. And you can go up the top of Pilot's Knob. They also have a really nice, small but very nice museum with the history of Fort Phil Kearney and some Indian artifacts. And they also have the Federman massacre site, you know, preserved, which is pretty cool. You can go and walk that thing from where they went over Lodge Trail Ridge right down to where Wheatley and Fisher were killed. You can see the Bozeman Trail, which is kind of cool, right next to that. And you can go to the Wagenbachs fight and see what happened there as well. So it's a pretty cool historical site, and we'll get into that a little later if we can keep this in mind. If we take our trip in May with the AP kids, I'll see how many of you kids might be interested. Maybe we'll slip over there and take a look at it. It's pretty interesting. If you go over, they give us a really nice show, and they show us all the different types of arrows that the Indians used, a lot of Indian artifacts, what the military was carrying, and they also fire a cannon for you, which is pretty cool. It's really kind of a cool thing. Then we'll go down to the Federman Fort, and they'll drop us off the top. We'll walk all the way down the bottom of the valley and see where the infantry fell and where Grumman and the cavalry fell, the tree. Go down to see where Wheatley and Fisher fell. It's pretty cool. Walk right down to Pinot Creek. It's a pretty cool thing. So anyway, that's where we're at. So would you like a little bit of a review that you could maybe mark up in your notes a little bit, or what? You would?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did everybody, who didn't get one of these? Okay, let me pass them here. So I gave these out on Friday.
I got one.
Okay, how about this row? Who does not have one? 1, 2. What this is, kiddos, is the replica in the museum of what Fort Phil Kearney looked like in the day. How many in this row? 2, 3?
2.
And 3 left here, right? Okay. That's kind of a cool design. All right. Well, go. Just amazingly, look what I have here. Wow.
Is that what you are? Why? What's that on? Yeah, what's that one?
Okay, here's the rule. You spend the rest of the period quietly working on this to my satisfaction. I will let you put this in your notebook tomorrow and use it. If I don't think you're working very hard, then I'm going to collect them before the test tomorrow. But this is an open note test tomorrow. So if you want to get in groups and work on it, you're welcome to do that. This is the test. There will be no, listen to me, there will be no changes on this tomorrow. 35 points, 3 points apiece. It'll be worth 100 and some odd. If you guys want to go over to the other club, be good thing. Yeah. It's gonna be worth 140 tomorrow. Mrs. Montoya, right down to my office.
Okay. We can go west.
That's very great. You see it? Okay, planes in the display
Freedom Buffalo Religion.
Oh, awesome.
Okay, name the two roles of the plane names.
Wait, what's that? Freedom Buffalo.
Yeah,
Okay, the room's open, Mrs. Montoya. I don't want any cell phones out, just you working.
okay, sounds good. You guys ready to go? Okay.
Right there,
What?
it was, they made their boats a new moon, right?
The bowl is in the shape of a new moon. Not a moon from the top of Lodge Trail Ridge.
So one was.
You know, you wanna know how I guessed that, Mr. J?
No? I mean, yeah, I do want to know.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know how Indians didn't really have like full-on clothing? I completely spaced if this was, you know, wintertime. I just figured, you know, their butts are already halfway hanging out with their type of clothing. Maybe they just like turned around and started shaking the rope. That's what I said?
It was
Bro, as soon as you told me I was right, I...
Okay, let's get to working.
Shh.